This is another crazy story. For some reason, this woman didn't want her man knowing where she lived. My name is Carl, and I am a 38-year-old IT specialist who owns his own business. My customers are generally medical facilities that are subject to HIPAA. My primary responsibility is to build their networks, both hardware and software, and ensure it is fully HIPAA compliant, as well as meeting ISO 27001 standards. It is a tough job, and it requires a lot of hours each week. Just after I finished school, I started working in my field. I also met Cammie. Cammie is a beautiful redhead with large blue eyes and a slender body. She was 17 at the time, almost 7 years my junior. I was working days and attending school 4 nights a week, working on my master's degree. I met Cammie's mom at dinner one night, but my friends were telling me to leave her alone, making jokes like, toss her back in for a while. Sometimes your friends can see things you can't. So I did. I moved across the country about 2 years later and forgot about Cammie for almost another 3 years. Then I saw an opportunity to start a business back in my old home state and jumped on it. Within a few more years, I was doing okay. I had paid off all my student loans, paid off my car, and had almost paid off my home. Seems like this man had his shit together. Not bad for a man in his early 30s, I would agree. Then I ran into Cammie at a local restaurant where she was serving tables. She saw me before I saw her. She handed me her phone number on a small note. I called her a few days later and invited her out. She had to work that night, but told me when her days off were, so we started dating. I never paid much attention to it, but Cammie always wanted to meet at the place we were going. Yeah, that's kind of suspicious. Most women, at least from my experience, they want you to pick them up at their home if you're going on a date. Looking back, I should have seen the red flag. Cammie was careful that I did not see where she lived. I finally asked Cammie why she didn't want me to know where she lived. She must have anticipated this question because her answer was quick. She says, I'm living with 3 other girls and they're all LGBT and hate men. Oh, likely response. Stupid me bought it. It wasn't long before Cammie started sleeping over at my home. After about 6 months, I asked Cammie to marry me, and she said yes. She needed some time to get out of her apartment lease. Then, one day, I was on a ladder working up inside a suspended ceiling when I heard a man's voice ask if I was Carl. I was running some conduit, so I stopped working and came down off the ladder. I found myself face to face with the man I had never seen before. He said his name was Dave and asked why I was screwing his girl. Yep, she was already with someone. That's why she gave him the line about living with 3 other women who didn't like men. He then showed me some photos of us together, taken over the last several months. Then he showed me a photo of him and Cammie together. I felt sick to my stomach. All I could do was stutter and say, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Dave left, thankfully without any violence. I finished my task that day and drove home in a foul mood. I stopped by a package store, bought a 6-pack and went home. About 30 minutes later, Cammie came in, upset. I informed her that I had met Dave. Carl, Dave is stalking me. We were once close. I told you I had an old boyfriend I broke up with months before you and I got back together. By this time, Cammie had moved all her things into my home. She was still being forced to keep paying on her apartment lease. I normally don't snoop, but while Cammie was asleep that night, I got up and got her phone. I walked into my office and, using some tools I have, I was able to access her Android phone. I downloaded the entire contents onto my PC. I started looking through it, but Cammie had done a great job of keeping it clean. I found nothing, so I dropped it and believed her. Big mistake. Cammie and I got married a while later. Then Cammie told me she was pregnant. I can't explain why, but her telling me she was pregnant triggered something in my brain. The next day, I went to see a friend who is a great private investigator and told him the entire story. I wanted to know who this Dave person was. My friend already knew Cammy, so he didn't need me to provide much information. About a month later, he came by the house and said, "Carl, we need to talk." Cammy was in the kitchen making dinner. As soon as he sat down, he handed me a large envelope. Inside were photos of Cammy and Dave entering a local hotel. The photos were time and date stamped, and they were very recent. I also had Dave's address. This time I went to Dave's home and waited for him. I had a lot of paperwork to do, so I stayed busy. Then I heard a knock on my door and saw Dave standing there. I asked, "Did you know Cammy is my wife?" He grinned and said yes, then advised me to leave and get off his property. I went to see a local attorney and went over all my options. The attorney said, "There is a 50-50 chance that the baby isn't yours. Don't sign anything until you clear it with me." I drove home, packed a bag, and booked a room for a week. That night, Cammy blew up my phone. The next morning, I had a huge amount of voice messages, starting with, "Where are you?" and ending with, "Carl, I'm so sorry." After that week, I had time to think. I decided to move into our guest bedroom. I was waiting for the birth. If the baby wasn't mine, I was going to kick Cammy out of the house. I basically ignored her during this time. I paid for the food brought into the house and had her on my health insurance. Then the day came and the baby was born. It was our son, and Cammy named him Peter after her dad. Before she was discharged, the nurse came into the room to swab Peter as well as Cammy. I had already been swabbed and wanted to witness the baby being swabbed. I was only in the room for the test. Cammy was pleading with me to show her some love. My in-laws were there, and they questioned me about not agreeing with the paternity test. I said, "Because your darling daughter was also screwing Dave at the time." I let my in-laws stay in the house while I left for about 2 weeks. When the test results came back, they confirmed I was the father. I spoke to my attorney, and he said we're still in good shape because Cammy is on record for committing adultery. In this state, that's grounds for divorce. You can also get 50-50 custody of your son. When I started spending time with Peter, I began to develop a love for that little guy. So stupid me asked Cammy to go to marriage counseling with me. I made it clear that Cammy had to make a choice that day. She chose me. I finally got a lot off my mind and went back to work. All seemed well for a long time. Then I started to notice Cammy getting distant again. I paid another visit to my private investigator friend. He said he would start tracking Cammy again. See, this is the definition of insanity. Why is he wasting money on marriage counseling? Because of the kid? Come on, man. I decided to stop worrying about it and took Peter, who is a toddler by then, to visit my parents. While there, my dad walked out onto the patio with 2 beers and asked me what was wrong. He already knew about Dave. I said, "Dad, I think Cammy may be cheating again." He asked if I had hired a private investigator. I said I did. I drove back home, and when I got there, Cammy was home. I was holding my son when I walked in, and Cammy was sitting at the table looking at an envelope. My friend had to leave town on an emergency, and his assistant had hand-delivered the report to me, but she gave it to Cammy. By the time I got home, Cammy had read it and looked at the photos. She looked at me and asked, "Why were you following me?" I forcefully took the envelope and its contents from her. I walked into my home office and put it in my safe, which Cammy couldn't open. I got my things and moved back into the guest room. That night, I told Cammy I would be filing for divorce. Later, I heard Cammy's car start up. I got up and looked around, thinking she had left. Cammy had taken our son to her parents' house and then came back home the next morning, wanting to talk. I told her, "Cammy, I still care for you, but I can't trust you. There's nothing more to discuss." I also suggested she get a job because with the divorce, I likely wouldn't have to support her for long. For some reason, Cammy left our son at her parents' house and ran off with Dave. Later, I had learned Dave had been stealing from his job to the tune of about $130,000 over several years. We couldn't serve Cammy. My attorney had a rough time going in front of a judge. listing all the things we had tried to get Cammy served. We were working on this problem when my father-in-law came by my home and brought Peter so I could see him. He said that Cammy was locked up in New Mexico with Dave. I asked him where and called my attorney. Cammy had been arrested for drunk driving on I-40 and resisting arrest to the point of assaulting a police officer. This was all my attorney needed. He traveled to New Mexico and, with the witness, served Cammy. She signed the papers. In the meantime, I had 100% custody of Peter, but agreed with my in-laws that it was best they keep him for now. Later, I learned they found drugs in the car, and both Cammy and Dave would be staying in New Mexico for a while. Dave got almost 2 years, and Cammy was sentenced to time served. She was given a year of probation, but after some planning, it was agreed she could serve the probation here. My job involved so many hours a week that I couldn't take care of my son properly. I paid my in-laws child support and kept Peter on my insurance. Because we were divorced and I had brought the house into the marriage, I was allowed to keep it. I also didn't have to give Cammy any financial support. After she returned home, she started pushing for 100% custody of Peter. Thankfully, my in-laws supported me. I was concerned Cammy might kidnap Peter if she got unsupervised visitation. Because Cammy was living in the same home as her parents and Peter, I didn't sleep well for months. Later, Cammy did take Peter and left the state, which was a probation violation. It took about 3 days, but Cammy and Peter were found. This time, I hired a nanny for Peter. Cammy still tries from time to time to see Peter unsupervised, but each time the judge uses the Amber Alert rules against her. I'm still single and plan to stay that way. Peter is getting older now. I finally hired the nanny full-time as both a nanny and maid. She also cooks. Dave was eventually released and returned. I've heard that he and Cammy are still seen around town. Not long ago, Dave beat Cammy almost to death. They were both drunk and fighting over something. Cammy spent several days in the hospital, and Dave was jailed. The other day, I saw them together, walking toward a store. When I think about that beautiful 17-year-old redhead, I can't help but shake my head at what Cammy has become. One day, Peter is going to want to know why his mother is like this. I've decided to answer all his questions and show him all the videos and photos of his mother running around with Dave, if necessary. Well, in my opinion, he should have washed his hands of this woman the first time he knew she was cheating on him with Dave. Him suggesting marriage counseling after he found out he was a father was really confusing to me. What is marriage counseling going to do with that? All right, guys, that's it. Until next time.